The train hissed to a halt, a sigh of steam in the vast, indifferent quiet of the prairie. Elara Stepney descended, clutching a worn valise and a letter, its creases softened by countless readings. The paper promised a life with Silas Blackwood, a home carved from the wilderness, a partnership. Hope, a fragile bird, had carried her across an ocean and half a continent. The wagon driver, a man named Henderson whose silence was as expansive as the landscape, merely grunted when she showed him the scrap of paper bearing Silas's name and the rough directions to his homestead. He loaded her valise onto the buckboard with an air of weary resignation, as if he'd ferried too many hopefuls to too many desolate ends. The journey from the small rail stop was long, the ruts in the track jarring her bones, mirroring the unease that had begun to settle in her heart. The sun beat down, relentless, and the sky stretched, an endless, pale canvas. When Henderson finally reined in the horses, gesturing with a curt nod towards a structure almost swallowed by tall grass, Elara's fragile bird of hope faltered, its wings heavy. The Blackwood homestead was not the modest but sturdy picture Silas's sparse words had painted. It was a cabin, yes, but weathered to a silver grey that spoke of neglect more than age, its porch sagging, a window pane cracked like a spider's web. No smoke curled from the chimney. No welcoming figure stood in the doorway. An unnatural stillness clung to the place, broken only by the whisper of wind through the dry grass. "This is it," Henderson stated, his voice flat. He unloaded her valise, setting it in the dust. He looked at her then, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, pity, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement of a harsh truth. "Blackwood ain't been seen in town for a spell." Elara paid him the agreed amount, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded again and, without another word, climbed back onto his seat and urged the horses forward, leaving her alone in the encroaching twilight with her meager belongings and a growing dread. The letter felt suddenly cold in her hand. She approached the cabin, her steps hesitant. The door creaked open under her touch, revealing an interior dim and disordered. A rough-hewn table stood askew, holding a single tin plate with remnants of a meal long past. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something akin to despair. And then she heard it, a faint rustle from a shadowed corner, followed by a tiny cough. Her heart leaped. Silas? But the sounds were too small, too tentative. Moving further into the gloom, her eyes adjusting, she saw them. 7 pairs of eyes, wide and staring, from a cluster of figures huddled near the cold hearth. Children. The eldest, a girl with braided hair the color of wheat, stood protectively in front of the smaller ones, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. She might have been 15, 16 at most. The youngest, a toddler with tear-streaked cheeks, clutched a rag doll. There was no sign of Silas Blackwood. Where is Mr. Blackwood?" Elara asked, her voice strained. The eldest girl's chin lifted. "PA's gone," she said, her voice low and steady, though a tremor ran beneath it. "Took sick. Passed a month ago." A month. The letter in Elara's hand was dated 3 months prior. Arrangements made, perhaps, by a man already facing his end, or by someone else entirely, a desperate, unheard plea. The fragile bird of hope in Elara's chest stilled, then fell, a stone into a deep well. No groom. No partner. Only 7 orphan children, staring at her with a mixture of suspicion and desperate, unspoken need. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the toddler's soft sniffle. Elara sank onto a rickety stool, the valise dropping from her numb fingers. The prairie wind moaned outside, a lament for dreams turned to dust. The reality was stark, she was a stranger, far from anything familiar, her own meager resources dwindling, now faced with a responsibility she had never sought, a life she had never envisioned. The eldest girl, Martha, watched her, unwavering. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. Elara looked at the children, truly looked at them, their thin faces, their patched clothing, the haunted look in their eyes. She thought of the long journey, the promises made, the vast emptiness outside and the echoing emptiness within. She could leave. Henderson would likely pass this way again. She could return to the rail stop, try to find passage back, somewhere, anywhere. But the image of those 7 pairs of eyes, fixed on her, held her rooted to the spot. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 4, peeked out from behind Martha's skirt, his thumb in his mouth. His gaze was direct, innocent, yet filled with an ancient weariness. This was not what she had come for, but it was what she had found. The wind howled again, a lonely, searching sound. Ilara took a slow, deep breath, the scent of dust and disuse filling her lungs. The choice, she realized, was not truly a choice at all. The first dawn at the Blackwood homestead broke cold and grey, mirroring the desolation Ilara felt. Yet, with the pale light came a sliver of resolve. She could not undo Silas Blackwood's death, nor her own bewildering predicament, but she could address the immediate. The children were hungry, the cabin a testament to prolonged neglect. She rose from the hard-packed dirt floor where she'd managed a few hours of restless sleep, her body stiff, her mind racing. The children were still asleep, huddled together for warmth on a collection of thin blankets and straw ticks. Even in sleep, they looked vulnerable, their faces smudged, their breathing shallow. Martha, the eldest, stirred first, her eyes flying open, instantly wary. She sat up, pulling a threadbare quilt tighter around a younger sister. "What are you doing?" Martha's voice was sharp, suspicious. "Looking for something to make breakfast," Ilara said, her tone even, trying to project a calm she did not feel. The pantry, when she found it, was a sorry sight, a handful of potatoes, withered and sprouting, half a sack of weevils-ridden flour, a small jar of dried beans. Not nearly enough. She started with the hearth, clearing out old ashes. There was a little wood left in a box nearby. She managed to coax a small fire to life, the smoke initially reluctant before finding its way up the chimney. The smell of burning wood, faint as it was, seemed to bring a small measure of life back into the cabin. One by one, the younger children woke, drawn by the light and the unusual activity. They watched her, silent and wide-eyed. Ilara found a kettle and a bucket, and indicated the need for water. A boy of about 10, Thomas, pointed silently towards the door. The well outside required effort, the rope frayed, the bucket heavy, but the water was clear and cold. Back inside, she put water on to boil, contemplating the meager potatoes. She'd make a thin soup, perhaps, stretch it with a little of the salvageable flour. As she worked, she spoke, her voice soft, asking their names. Martha supplied them reluctantly at first. Besides herself and Thomas, there was 9-year-old Sarah, who clung to Martha's side, 7-year-old Samuel, quiet and observant, 6-year-old twins, Lily and James, almost indistinguishable with their mops of dark hair, and little Ruth, the toddler, who was now warily eyeing Ilara from the safety of Martha's lap. The soup was thin, but warm. Ilara portioned it out into chip bowls, ensuring each child had a share before taking a small amount for herself. They ate in silence, the only sound the scraping of spoons. Afterwards, Ilara began to clean. The task was monumental. Layers of grime coated every surface. She found a worn broom and swept the floor, raising clouds of dust. She scrubbed the table, fetched more water to wash the few dishes. Martha watched her, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The younger children, however, began to thaw, their curiosity overcoming their fear. Lily tentatively offered to help carry out a pail of dirty water. Samuel pointed out where their father kept the lye soap. Small gestures, but significant. Later that day, as Ilara was attempting to air out the musty bedding, she found a small, leather-bound ledger tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the corner Silas must have used as his sleeping space. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, the entries detailing farm expenses, crop yields from seasons past, notes on animal husbandry. But interspersed were more personal observations, concerns about the coming winter, pride in Martha's quick mind, a tender mention of Ruth's first steps. A pang of sorrow, sharp and unexpected, pierced Ilara. This was the man she was meant to marry, a man who clearly loved his children, a man who had struggled. The ledger humanized him, made his absence more profound. It also revealed the dire state of their finances before his illness. They were, it seemed, utterly alone. As if summoned by her bleak thoughts, the rumble of a wagon announced Henderson's return. He was ostensibly checking on his route, but Ilara suspected he'd come to see if she had fled. He looked surprised to find her still there, a smudge of soot on her cheek, her sleeves rolled up. "Still here, then," he observed, his tone less gruff than before. "Yes," Ilara said simply. He looked towards the cabin, where two of the younger children peeked from the doorway. "Heard in town?" Silas passed quiet. The fever took him quick. He paused. Folks wondered about the young uns. Ilara's chin lifted slightly. "They are here. They are managing." Henderson grunted, then reached into the back of his wagon and pulled out a small sack. "Flour. Town miller owed me a bit. Not much use to me." He set it down near the valise Ilara hadn't yet unpacked. "Might be a week for I'm back this way." It wasn't charity, not quite, but it was a lifeline. Ilara thanked him, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. As he drove away, she looked at the sack of flour, then back at the cabin. The task ahead was still immense, the future terrifyingly uncertain, but for the first time since her arrival, a flicker of something other than despair stirred within her. It wasn't hope, not yet, but a stubborn refusal to be defeated. She had to make this work. For them. For herself. The first step was food, the next, perhaps, a garden. Silas's ledger mentioned seeds he'd put aside. If she could find them. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by necessity. Ilara rose before dawn, coaxing the fire, preparing what meager food they had. The flour from Henderson was a blessing, allowing for thin gruel and, on one occasion, a small, flat loaf of bread baked on a hot stone by the fire, a treat that brought faint smiles to the children's faces. She found Silas's stored seeds, beans, squash, corn, tucked away in a dry corner of the small, dilapidated barn. The earth in the neglected garden patch beside the cabin was hard and unforgiving, but Ilara, with Thomas's surprisingly strong assistance, managed to turn over small sections, planting with a prayer for rain and sun. Martha remained distant, watchful. She performed her chores with a sullen efficiency, caring for Ruth, mending torn clothes with nimble fingers, but she offered no warmth, no conversation beyond clipped answers to direct questions. Ilara understood. This strange woman had usurped her father's place, her home, however unintentionally. Trust would not come easily. The younger children, however, were slowly, tentatively, drawing closer. Sarah, shy and quiet, began to follow Ilara as she worked, handing her tools or fetching water without being asked. James and Lily, once they overcame their initial apprehension, revealed a mischievous streak, their suppressed laughter occasionally bubbling to the surface when Ilara stumbled over a prairie turnip or chased away a stray chicken. Samuel, the observant one, proved to be a source of quiet knowledge. He knew where the wild berries grew thickest, which roots were edible, and the subtle signs of changing weather. His shared secrets were small offerings of trust, precious and carefully received. One evening, as a cool wind swept across the plains, bringing with it the scent of rain, Samuel began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that worsened through the night. By morning, he was feverish, his small body trembling. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Ilara. She remembered Henderson's words about Silas, the fever took him quick. She pushed the thought away. She bathed Samuel's forehead with cool water, coaxed him to drink a weak willow bark tea she'd learned about from a passage in Silas's ledger about common ailments. For 2 days and nights, she barely left his side, tending to him with a gentle determination. Martha watched, her usual guardedness tinged with a raw anxiety Ilara recognized. This was how her father had started. On the third morning, Samuel's fever broke. He woke, weak but lucid, and asked for a drink of water in a small, clear voice. The relief that washed over Ilara was immense, leaving her trembling. She helped him sip, then smoothed his hair back from his damp forehead. When she looked up, Martha was standing in the doorway, her expression softer than Ilara had ever seen it. She didn't say anything, but she met Ilara's gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the wall between them seemed to lower. The incident with Samuel, though terrifying, marked a subtle shift. Martha began to offer quiet suggestions about the running of the homestead, how their father used to rotate the small flock of chickens to keep the ground fertile, the best way to scare crows from the new seedlings. Ilara listened, grateful for the shared knowledge. They still weren't friends, not yet, but a fragile understanding was beginning to form. A storm blew in not long after, the wind howling like a hungry wolf, the rain lashing against the cabin. A leak, previously unnoticed, opened up in the roof above the children's sleeping area, sending a steady drip onto their blankets. Panic flickered in the younger children's eyes. Ilara, with Thomas and a surprisingly capable Martha, scrambled to move the bedding, then climbed precariously onto a stool, trying to stuff rags into the offending gap while rain plastered her hair to her face. They worked together, a small, desperate team, until the worst of the leak was stemmed. Soaked and shivering, they huddled around the fire afterwards, a shared sense of accomplishment, however small, warming them almost as much as the flames. Ilara found herself studying Silas's notes more intently. He had ambitions for this place, sketches of a small irrigation ditch from the nearby creek, ideas for expanding the cultivated land. These were not the jottings of a defeated man, but of one who had dared to dream, even amidst hardship. His unrealized plans became a strange sort of legacy, a roadmap she felt compelled, in some small way, to follow. The children, too, began to share more. Sarah shyly showed Ilara a small, smooth stone her mother had given her. Thomas spoke of fishing with his father in the creek. Even Martha, one evening, mentioned a lullaby their mother used to sing, her voice hushed with memory. Each shared fragment was a thread, weaving them slowly, imperceptibly, together. The path ahead remained daunting, but it no longer felt quite so solitary. The fragile peace they had begun to build was shattered by the arrival of a stout, stern-faced man on a well-groomed horse. He dismounted with an air of authority, his eyes sweeping over the homestead with unconcealed disapproval. He introduced himself as Josiah Finch, a representative from the county seat, tasked with matters concerning orphan children and unsettled estates. His presence was an immediate blight on the landscape, his gaze cold as he took in Ilara's worn dress and the children huddled behind her. "I understand Silas Blackwood passed some weeks ago," Finch began, his voice devoid of sympathy. "A regrettable situation. The county has been made aware of these unfortunate circumstances." He gestured vaguely at the children, then at the cabin. "There are procedures for such cases. The children are, by law, wards of the county." Ilara felt a chill snake down her spine. "Wards?" "Indeed," Finch affirmed, a thin smile playing on his lips. "They require proper care, a suitable environment. This," he gestured again, more pointedly this time, "hardly qualifies." Martha stepped forward slightly, her young face set in defiant lines. "We're fine. We're managing." Finch's eyes flicked to Martha, dismissing her instantly. "Children are not equipped to manage an estate, nor raise themselves. It is my duty to see they are placed in appropriate settings. The orphanage in Ashton is well run, or perhaps foster families can be found. Split them up." Ilara's voice was sharper than she intended. The thought of these siblings, already traumatized by loss, being torn from one another and from the only home they knew, was unbearable. "It is often the most practical solution," Finch said smoothly. "Finding a home for 7 children together is, shall we say, improbable." He then turned his attention fully to Ilara. "And you, madam? I understand you arrived recently. A mail-order arrangement, I presume? With no legal standing, no marriage having taken place, you have no claim here. No claim to them." His words were a deliberate slap, designed to diminish her, to assert his authority. But instead of crumbling, Ilara felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it surprised her. These children, who had been strangers only weeks before, had become her charge, her responsibility. She straightened her shoulders. "I am caring for them. This is their home. Their father wished for them to stay here." Finch raised an eyebrow. "A wish is not a legal document, madam. Silas Blackwood appears to have died intestate. The land, what little value it possesses, may well be forfeit to cover his debts." He exuded an oily confidence that made Ilara's skin crawl. The children, sensing the gravity of the threat, pressed closer to Ilara. Little Ruth began to cry, burying her face in Ilara's skirt. Samuel, his earlier illness still leaving him pale, slipped his small hand into hers. Even Martha, though her expression remained stoic, positioned herself slightly in front of the younger ones, a silent shield. Seeing their fear, their unspoken plea, solidified Ilara's resolve. She would not let this man destroy the fragile security they had begun to forge. They will not be split up, Ilara stated, her voice low but firm. And they will not be taken from this land. I will provide for them. Finch chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. And how do you propose to do that, madam? You are a lone woman, with no resources, no experience. This farm is barely clinging to life. We will make it work, Ilara insisted, though a knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She had no concrete plan, only a desperate, burning need to protect them. Finch consulted a pocket watch with an air of bored impatience. I will be generous. You have 1 month. 1 month to demonstrate that this household, he invested the word with disdain, is viable. That the children are adequately cared for, schooled, and that the farm shows signs of productivity. If, at the end of that time, I am not satisfied, I will return with the necessary papers and the constable. The children will be removed. He mounted his horse, his gaze lingering on Ilara with a look that clearly conveyed his certainty of her failure. 1 month, madam. Do not disappoint the county. He rode off, leaving behind a silence thick with apprehension. The children looked at Ilara, their faces a mixture of fear and a dawning, desperate hope. Martha's gaze met hers, and in that moment, the last vestiges of her suspicion seemed to crumble, replaced by a grudging respect and a shared sense of crisis. The threat was real, imminent. 1 month. It felt like an impossibly short time to transform their precarious existence into something Finch would deem viable, but as Ilara looked at the 7 anxious faces turned towards her, she knew she had to try. She had to fight. This was no longer just about survival, it was about defiance. It was about home. The deadline Josiah Finch had imposed hung over them like a storm cloud, lending a desperate urgency to their days. 1 month. 30 short days to transform a struggling, grief-stricken household into a picture of stability and productivity. Ilara knew it was a monumental task, perhaps an impossible one, but the sight of the children's fearful, trusting faces fueled a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She gathered them around the rough-hewn table that evening, the cabin lit by a single flickering tallow candle. Mr. Finch wants to take you away, she said, her voice quiet but firm. He wants to send you to different places, to an orphanage, little Lily gasped, her eyes wide with terror. James burrowed closer to Martha. I will not let that happen. But we must work together. We must show him that this is a good home, that you are safe and cared for, and that we can make this farm work. For the first time, Martha spoke without prompting, her voice clear and determined. Pa always said this land was good, if you worked it right. He had plans. Then we will follow his plans, Ilara declared. And make some of our own. The next morning, they began. Ilara, drawing on Silas's ledger and her own faint memories of her grandfather's small farm, directed their efforts. The garden became their primary focus. Every child old enough to work was assigned tasks. Thomas, with his surprising strength, helped Ilara expand the cultivated patch, turning over more of the stubborn soil. Martha, her earlier sullenness replaced by a focused intensity, took charge of the weeding and watering, her movements efficient and knowledgeable. Sarah, Samuel, and even the twins, Lily and James, were tasked with collecting stones, chasing away pests, and carrying water in small buckets from the creek. Little Ruth, too young to truly help, assisted by patting dirt clods with serious concentration, her presence a small, heartwarming constant. They mended fences to protect their meager flock of chickens from predators, using scavenged wood and twisted vines. Ilara, with Martha's help, meticulously cleaned the cabin, airing out bedding, scrubbing floors until her hands were raw, determined to present an image of order and cleanliness when Finch returned. She even attempted to create a makeshift schoolroom, using charred sticks as pencils and smoothed pieces of bark as slates, trying to teach the younger children their letters from a tattered primer she found amongst Silas's belongings. Progress was slow, back-breaking. The sun beat down mercilessly, and their muscles ached. There were moments of frustration, of near despair, when a new setback occurred, a fox snatching a chicken, a section of the newly planted beans failing to sprout. But they persevered, driven by the shared threat. One afternoon, as Ilara struggled to repair a broken handle on their only hoe, a familiar wagon rumbled into view. It was Henderson, the taciturn driver. He watched their frantic activity for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Heard Finch was out this way," he said, his voice low. "Caused a stir in town, talking about the Blackwood orphans." Ilara nodded, her heart sinking. "He means to take them." Henderson spat into the dust. "Finch always did have an eye for what ain't his. Some say he's got designs on acquiring land cheap, especially from folks in trouble." He paused, then looked at the broken hoe in her hand. "That ain't gonna last." He rummaged in the back of his wagon and produced a sturdy, well-used hoe, its metal head gleaming faintly. "Got this extra. Take it." Ilara stared at him, speechless for a moment. I can't pay you for it right now." "Ain't asking for payment," he grumbled, avoiding her gaze. A tool's meant to be used. He also left them a small bag of potatoes and a slab of salt pork, claiming they were surplus. His gruff kindness was a balm to Ilara's frayed nerves, a small sign that they were not entirely alone in their struggle. A few days later, another unexpected visitor arrived. A woman, her face weathered but kind, rode up on a sturdy mare. She introduced herself as Mrs. Albright, from a farm several miles to the east. "Heard tell of your situation, dear," she said, her voice warm. "Silas was a good man, though kept to himself mostly. It ain't right what that Finch is trying to do." She had brought a basket filled with fresh eggs, a loaf of her own bread, and some jars of preserved fruit. More importantly, she offered advice on preserving vegetables for the winter, knowledge of local plants that could supplement their diet, and words of encouragement that bolstered Ilara's spirits immensely. Mrs. Albright's visit was a reminder that community, however scattered, still existed. The children, witnessing these small acts of support, began to work with even greater determination. They saw Ilara's tireless efforts, her unwavering commitment to them, and their trust in her deepened. Martha, in particular, became Ilara's shadow, her right hand, anticipating needs, offering practical solutions gleaned from her father's teachings. The farm, under their combined efforts, slowly began to show signs of life. The rows of beans and squash grew greener, the corn stalks taller. The cabin, scrubbed and tidied, looked more like a home. It was still a desperate race against time, but now, there was a sliver of hope, a fighting chance. Ilara knew Finch would be looking for any excuse to condemn them, but she was equally determined to give him none. In the frantic effort to prepare for Finch's return, every corner of the small cabin and its surroundings was scrutinized for potential improvement or resource. It was during one such search, looking for anything of value that might be sold for much-needed supplies or perhaps a document that could lend weight to their claim to stay, that Martha made a discovery. Tucked away in a dusty wooden box beneath Silas's narrow cot, a place overlooked in their initial, grief-stricken sortings, was a collection of papers far more personal than the farm ledger. Amongst them were several letters, written in Silas's neat hand, addressed to a sister in a distant state, letters it seemed he had never found the means or perhaps the heart to send. There were also sketches of the farm, not just as it was, but as he dreamed it could be, with a larger barn, an orchard, a fence strong enough to keep out any predator. And then, at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth, was a document that made Ilara's heart stop. It was a will, informally drawn perhaps, and never filed with any county clerk, but clearly written and signed by Silas Blackwood. In it, he bequeathed his land and all his meager possessions to his 7 children, naming them individually, and expressed his fervent wish that they remain together, on the homestead, under the care of so good and honest woman, should Providence provide one. He even specified Martha, as the eldest, to have a guiding hand until the youngest reached maturity. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes as she read the carefully penned words. This was Silas, not just as an absent groom or a struggling farmer, but as a father, his love for his children, his anxieties and hopes for their future, laid bare on the page. The phrase "a good and honest woman" resonated deeply. Had he anticipated her arrival even as his health failed? Or was it a more general prayer? It didn't matter. The document felt like a message from beyond the grave, a validation of her struggle, a shield against Finch's machinations. His words painted a picture of a man who, despite his hardships, possessed a quiet dignity and an unshakable devotion to his family. He wrote of the creek, how it could be diverted with careful work to irrigate a larger field, a patch of land further from the cabin that he believed held the richest soil. He even mentioned a hidden cache of well-seasoned timber he'd been saving for repairs to the barn roof, hidden under a pile of old hay to keep it dry. This was practical, valuable information they desperately needed. "He wanted us to stay," Martha whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she read over Ilara's shoulder. The other children gathered around, their expression solemn as Ilara explained the significance of the papers. Samuel traced Silas's signature with a small finger. Even Ruth seemed to sense the importance of the moment, her usual toddler restlessness stilled. The discovery of the will, informal though it was, and Silas's detailed notes, infused them all with renewed purpose. It was as if Silas himself was guiding them, his hopes for the future of his children and his land giving them strength. Ilara felt a profound connection to this man she had never met, a sense of shared purpose that transcended her initial disappointment. She was no longer just an outsider trying to salvage a desperate situation, she was fulfilling a dying man's most cherished wish. They found the seasoned timber exactly where Silas's notes indicated, enough to securely patch the barn roof and reinforce a section of the cabin wall that had begun to sag. They studied his sketches for the irrigation ditch, Thomas and Martha eagerly discussing how they might begin such a project, even on a small scale. The patch of richest soil he'd identified was further afield, requiring more effort to clear and cultivate, but the promise it held was a powerful motivator. Silas's writings became their most treasured possession. Ilara read passages aloud in the evenings, not just the practical advice, but the expressions of his love for them, his dreams for their lives. It was a way of keeping his memory alive, not as a source of sorrow, but as an inspiration. His influence, though he was absent, was palpable, shaping their efforts, strengthening their resolve. He had left them more than just a struggling farm, he had left them a legacy of resilience, a blueprint for survival, and a testament to the enduring power of parental love. As the day of Finch's threatened return drew nearer, Ilara held onto Silas's words like a talisman. They might be poor, they might be struggling, but they had a right to be here, a right declared by the man who had poured his life into this very soil. And Ilara, the woman Providence had seemingly provided, would ensure that right was defended. The month passed in a blur of relentless labor and anxious anticipation. The small garden showed promise, with green shoots pushing bravely through the soil. The cabin, scrubbed and mended, looked more welcoming. The children, though still thin, had a new alertness in their eyes, a sense of purpose that had replaced some of their earlier fear. Ilara had drilled them on their letters and numbers, and Martha could now read simple passages from Silas's worn Bible with surprising fluency. They were as ready as they could ever be. On the appointed day, Josiah Finch arrived, true to his word. He was not alone. Beside him rode the local constable, a man named Miller, whose face was grim and reluctant. Finch's expression was one of smug expectation, clearly anticipating failure. He dismounted, his gaze sweeping critically over the homestead. "Well, madam," Finch began, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your time is up. Let us see what miracles you have wrought." Ilara stood her ground, the children arrayed behind her, a small, determined phalanx. Martha stood beside her, no longer a child, but a young woman steeled by responsibility. "We have worked hard, Mr. Finch," Ilara said, her voice steady. "This is our home. The children are well, and we are making this farm productive." Finch scoffed. "Productive? A few struggling rows of vegetables? A cabin that barely stands? This is not a suitable environment for raising children." He turned to Constable Miller. "You can see for yourself, Constable. Neglect is evident." Constable Miller, however, did not look convinced. His gaze lingered on the neatly swept yard, the patched but sturdy fence around the chicken coop, the surprisingly organized interior of the cabin visible through the open door. He noted the children, their clothes clean, albeit patched, their faces showing none of the vacant despair he often saw in truly neglected cases. He saw the way they clustered around Ilara, not in fear, but with a fierce loyalty. "Sir," Ilara said, stepping forward, her hand holding the oilcloth-wrapped bundle of Silas's papers. "Before you pass judgment, there is something you should see." She carefully unfolded the will, handing it to Constable Miller. "This is Silas Blackwood's last will and testament. He clearly states his wish for his children to remain here, together, on this land." Finch attempted to dismiss it. An informal document, likely worthless. Unwitnessed, unfiled. But Constable Miller was reading it, his brow furrowed in concentration. He then looked at Silas's letters, the detailed notes about the farm. He saw the love and forethought in the man's careful script. He looked up, his gaze meeting Ilara's. There was a flicker of something new in his eyes, respect, perhaps, or dawning understanding. Just then, another figure appeared, riding up the track. It was Mrs. Albright, her expression determined. "Constable Miller, Mr. Finch," she said, dismounting with surprising agility. "I heard you were headed this way. I came to speak on behalf of this family." She stood beside Ilara, a small, formidable woman. "I have visited them regularly. These children are not neglected. They are loved, they are learning, and Miss Stepney is working miracles with what little she has. Silas would be proud. This community, what there is of it, supports them staying here." Finch sputtered, clearly taken aback by this unexpected show of support. "Community? One interfering woman? This is a matter for the county, for the law." "The law also respects a man's last wishes, Mr. Finch," Constable Miller said, his voice carrying a new note of authority. He handed the will back to Ilara. "While it may not have been formally filed, it clearly shows Mr. Blackwood's intent. And what I see here," he gestured to the homestead, to the children, to Ilara, "is not neglect, but a family struggling, yes, but struggling together, with courage and determination." He turned to Finch. "I see no immediate cause to remove these children, sir. They seem adequately cared for, and there is evidence of a plan for their sustenance." Finch's face turned a mottled red. "This is outrageous. I am an officer of the county. I will not be defied. And I am the law in this particular jurisdiction, Mr. Finch," Miller stated calmly. "And my assessment is that intervention is not warranted at this time. I suggest you return to Ashton. I will file a report stating my findings." Martha let out a small, audible gasp of relief. Thomas grinned, a wide, unrestrained smile. Even little Ruth seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, cooing softly. Finch, thwarted and furious, glared at Ilara, then at Mrs. Albright, and finally at the implacable Constable Miller. He knew he was beaten, for now. "This is not over," he snarled, climbing heavily onto his horse. "I will find other avenues." He galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent rage in his wake. Constable Miller touched the brim of his hat to Ilara and Mrs. Albright. "Keep up the good work, ladies. And file that will, Miss Stepney. It may offer more protection than you think." He then turned his horse and rode off at a more measured pace. For a long moment after they were gone, no one spoke. Then, Sarah let out a whoop of joy, quickly stifled when Martha shot her a look, but the relief was palpable. Ilara felt her knees tremble, the adrenaline of the confrontation ebbing away, leaving her weak but profoundly grateful. They had faced their first major test, and they had stood firm. They had won. Mrs. Albright beamed, patting Ilara's arm. "You did well, dear. You all did." Ilara looked at the children, their faces alight with a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. She looked at Martha, who met her gaze with a rare, open smile. They were not just a collection of individuals thrown together by circumstance anymore. They were a unit, bound by shared hardship and a growing affection. The threat from Finch might linger, but for today, they had secured their home. The reprieve granted by Constable Miller's intervention did not mean their struggles were over, but it shifted the atmosphere from one of desperate crisis to one of determined construction. Finch's parting threat lingered, a shadow in the back of their minds, but the immediate fear of separation had lifted, replaced by a shared focus on building a sustainable future. The garden, nurtured by their collective efforts, began to yield its first modest bounty. The taste of fresh beans, simmered with a tiny piece of salt pork Henderson had found surplus on another of his infrequent but always timely visits, was a feast. The squash vines curled and spread, promising a later harvest. The corn, though not as tall or full as Elara hoped, was growing. Each small success was a victory celebrated with quiet satisfaction. Elara, guided by Silas's notes and Mrs. Albright's practical advice, learned to preserve what they could, pickling beans, drying herbs found wild on the prairie. The children, now fully invested in their collective survival, took on their responsibilities with a newfound maturity. Thomas became adept at snaring rabbits and catching fish in the creek, supplementing their diet. Martha, her natural leadership blossoming, managed the younger children's chores and studies with a firm but fair hand, becoming Elara's indispensable partner. Sarah discovered a talent for mending, her small stitches neat and strong, making their worn clothes last longer. Samuel, with his quiet observation, often noticed things others missed, a weak spot in the fence, the early signs of blight on a plant. Even James and Lily contributed by diligently collecting firewood and keeping the water buckets filled, their earlier mischievousness channeled into productive energy. The rhythm of the seasons began to shape their lives. Summer days were long and arduous, filled with work under the hot sun, but evenings brought a measure of peace. They would gather outside the cabin as the prairie cooled, Elara sometimes reading aloud from Silas's Bible or the one worn storybook she possessed. Occasionally, Martha would hesitantly hum one of the lullabies her mother used to sing, and the younger children would lean against her, their eyelids heavy. These were moments of quiet connection, forging bonds deeper than blood. Elara taught them what she knew, sums, letters, stories of the world beyond the prairie. In turn, they taught her about the land, its secrets, its rhythms. She learned to identify edible plants, to read the signs of the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. She was no longer just Elara Stepney, the disappointed mail-order bride, she was becoming part of this place, part of this family. As autumn approached, bringing with it cooler days and the task of harvesting, a sense of accomplishment settled over the small homestead. Their root cellar, though not overflowing, held enough potatoes, squash, and preserved beans to see them through the winter with careful management. The barn roof, patched with Silas's timber, was secure. The cabin felt more like a home than ever before, filled with the sounds of the children's occasional laughter, the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. Elara had learned to make a passable sourdough. One crisp afternoon, as they worked together to bring in the last of the corn, Thomas paused, looking out over their small fields. "Pa would be proud, I reckon," he said, not to anyone in particular. Martha nodded silently, a wistful expression on her face. Elara felt a pang in her heart, a mixture of sorrow for the father these children missed so dearly, and a quiet gratitude for the unexpected family she had found. She was an outsider who had become an insider, a reluctant caregiver who had become a devoted mother in all but name. And these children, once wary strangers, were now hers, irrevocably. The life she had envisioned when she first read Silas's letter was nothing like this, yet this hard, demanding, often beautiful existence held a depth of meaning she could never have anticipated. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke, a promise of the winter to come, but also a testament to their resilience. They had faced the wilderness, both external and internal, and they were, slowly but surely, carving out a place for themselves, a home forged in hardship and love. The changing seasons brought not only the routines of harvest and preparation for winter, but also a lingering unease. Finch's parting words, "This is not over," echoed in Elara's quieter moments. She knew a man like him would not easily accept defeat, especially if he perceived an opportunity for personal gain. Rumors, carried by Henderson on one of his visits, confirmed her fears. Finch had been making inquiries in Ashton, trying to find evidence of Silas Blackwood's debts, subtly questioning Elara's character, suggesting a lone woman couldn't possibly manage such a responsibility. He was looking for leverage, a way to undermine their fragile stability. This new, insidious threat was different from the direct confrontation. It was a slow poison, intended to erode their standing, to isolate them. Elara felt a familiar tightening in her chest, but this time it was mingled with a fierce determination. She would not let Finch's malice undo everything they had worked for. The first snows arrived early that year, blanketing the prairie in a pristine, unforgiving white. The world shrank to the confines of their small homestead, the silence broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. It was a time of enforced closeness, testing their resources and their patience. Food supplies, carefully rationed, had to stretch. Firewood, diligently gathered, dwindled faster than anticipated in the biting cold. One evening, Lily came down with a croupy cough that quickly worsened, her breathing labored. The fear that had gripped Elara during Samuel's illness returned with chilling intensity. Memories of Silas's rapid decline, fueled by Finch's insinuations and the harshness of their isolated existence, haunted her sleepless nights. With Martha's steady help, Elara nursed Lily, using every remedy she knew, steam from kettles of boiling water, poultices of heated onions on her chest, sips of honeyed tea. The other children watched, their faces etched with worry, the small cabin filled with an anxious quiet. For days, Lily hovered between illness and recovery. During those long, tense hours, Elara found herself reflecting on her own journey. She thought of the hopes she'd carried across the ocean, the dreams of a shared life with a man she never knew. Those dreams had shattered upon her arrival, but in their place, something else, something unexpected and far more profound, had taken root. This life, with its relentless demands and its deep, fierce attachments, was now her reality, her purpose. The memory of Silas, once a symbol of her disappointment, had transformed. He was now a benevolent presence, his legacy not one of loss, but of love and resilience, a legacy she was determined to protect for his children, now her children. As Lily slowly began to recover, her breathing easing, her small hand clinging to Elara's, a new crisis emerged. Their meager supply of lamp oil was running dangerously low, and the nearest trading post was a 2-day journey by wagon, a perilous undertaking in the depths of winter. But light was essential, not just for practicality, but for morale. Leaving Martha in charge, a responsibility the young woman accepted with solemn maturity, Elara decided she had to make the trip. Henderson, whose route had been delayed by the heavy snows, happened to arrive just as she was preparing. He listened to her plan, his expression grim. "It's a hard road in this weather. Treacherous, but he also knew they had little choice." He offered to accompany her part of the way, as his route coincided for the first day. His presence, gruff but reassuring, was a comfort. The journey was brutal. The wind bit through her layers of clothing, the snowdrifts made progress agonizingly slow. But the thought of the children, waiting for her, relying on her, kept her going. At the trading post, she bartered ruthlessly for oil, flour, and a precious few medical supplies, using the last of her own small savings and a few skillfully knitted scarves Martha had made. The return journey, undertaken alone, was even more challenging, but the image of their small cabin, a beacon of warmth and life in the vast, frozen wilderness, pulled her onward. When she finally arrived, exhausted but triumphant, the welcome she received, the rush of children, Martha's quiet nod of relief, the warmth of the fire, was a reward beyond measure. They had faced another test, not from an external enemy, but from the harsh realities of their environment, and they had endured, together. Finch's shadow still lurked, but within the walls of their home, a resilient spirit, forged in shared adversity, burned brighter than ever. Spring eventually returned to the prairie, a slow unfurling of green against the muted browns and greys of winter. The creek swelled with meltwater, the air softened, and the familiar chorus of birdsong replaced the mournful howl of the wind. With the changing season came a renewed sense of hope and purpose for Elara and the children. They had survived the winter, their bond strengthened by the shared hardships. The garden was tilled and planted with an expertise born of experience, the children working with an easy camaraderie. Yet, the spectre of Josiah Finch had not entirely vanished. Word reached them, again via Henderson, that Finch was now attempting a new tactic, trying to prove that Silas Blackwood had outstanding debt significant enough to force the sale of the homestead, with himself conveniently positioned as a potential buyer. He was petitioning the county magistrate, armed with dubious ledgers and self-serving testimonies from supposed creditors. Ilara knew they couldn't simply ignore this. While Constable Miller had been sympathetic, a magistrate in Ashton, further removed from their daily lives and potentially swayed by Finch's persuasive rhetoric, might rule differently. She discussed it with Martha, who, despite her youth, possessed a keen understanding of their precarious situation. "We have PA's will," Martha said, "and Mrs. Albright and Mr. Henderson would speak for us. But Finch has connections." Ilara decided she could not wait for Finch to bring the fight to their doorstep again. She had to go to Ashton, to present Silas's will formally, to seek out the magistrate herself and plead their case before Finch could poison the well further. It was a daunting prospect. Ashton was a larger town, unfamiliar and intimidating. But the thought of losing everything they had fought for, of the children being cast adrift, spurred her on. Mrs. Albright, when Ilara confided in her, offered not only encouragement but also practical help. She knew a lawyer in Ashton, a Mr. Davies, known for his fairness, if a bit eccentric. She wrote a letter of introduction for Ilara. Henderson, on his next trip, agreed to take Ilara to Ashton, his usual gruffness softened by a clear concern for their plight. Leaving the children in Martha's capable care once more, though for a different, more uncertain purpose, was difficult, but necessary. In Ashton, the noise and bustle of the town were overwhelming after the quiet solitude of the prairie. Mr. Davies, the lawyer, was an elderly man with keen, intelligent eyes. He listened patiently as Ilara laid out their story, presenting Silas's will and letters, her voice earnest and steady. He examined the documents carefully. "This will, while not formally probated, shows clear intent," he mused. "And Finch, yes, I know of Mr. Finch. He has a reputation for aggressive acquisition." He agreed to represent them, to file the will officially, and to speak to Magistrate Thompson on their behalf. The wait for the magistrate's decision was agonizing. Ilara stayed in a modest boarding house, her meager funds dwindling. Days stretched into a week. Finch, she learned, was indeed actively lobbying, presenting his case with confidence. Then, finally, Mr. Davies summoned her. Magistrate Thompson wished to see her, and the children. The journey back to the homestead with Henderson, then returning to Ashton with all 7 children scrubbed clean and wearing their mended best, was an ordeal in itself. The children were understandably anxious, but they carried themselves with a quiet dignity that made Ilara's heart swell with pride. In the magistrate's chambers, a stern but not unkindly man, Josiah Finch, was already present, looking smug. He presented his arguments about Silas's supposed debts, the unsuitability of the homestead, Ilara's lack of legal standing. Then, Mr. Davies spoke, presenting Silas's will, recounting Ilara's efforts, and the children's desire to stay together in their home. Finally, Magistrate Thompson addressed Ilara directly, then turned to the children. He asked Martha, as the eldest, if she wished to stay on the farm with Ilara and her siblings. Martha, her voice clear and unwavering, spoke of her father's love for the land, of Ilara's kindness and strength, of their life together. "She is like a mother to us now," Martha concluded, her gaze steady. "We are a family." Even Samuel, usually so quiet, piped up, "We help. We have a garden." Magistrate Thompson listened intently. He looked from Finch's increasingly uncomfortable face to Ilara's earnest expression, to the hopeful, anxious faces of the children. He reviewed Silas's will one more time. "Mr. Finch," he said finally, his voice firm. "While I appreciate your diligence in bringing matters of potential debt to the county's attention, I find the evidence presented to be speculative at best. What I do find compelling is this document," he tapped Silas's will, "and the clear testimony of these children and Miss Stepney. It is the court's opinion that the welfare of these children is best served by allowing them to remain in their home, on their father's land, under the continued care of Miss Ilara Stepney, who has demonstrated remarkable fortitude and dedication." He declared Silas Blackwood's informal will to be a valid expression of his intent, granting Ilara de facto guardianship. "The matter is settled. The Blackwood homestead is secure." Finch, his face pale with fury and disbelief, could only stammer a protest before being dismissed. He knew he was utterly defeated. There were no more avenues left for him. Outside the magistrate's office, the children erupted in relieved cheers. Ilara, tears streaming down her face, hugged them tightly, one by one. Mr. Davies smiled benevolently. Mrs. Albright, who had quietly attended the hearing, beamed. Henderson, waiting with his wagon, even cracked a rare smile. The long shadow of Josiah Finch was finally, truly lifted. They were safe. They were home. The prairie wind, as they journeyed back, seemed to sing a song of peace, a song of hard-won belonging. Ilara looked at the faces of the children, alight with joy and relief, and knew that this unexpected, challenging path had led her to a destination more precious than any she could have imagined. The life Silas Blackwood had inadvertently offered her was now irrevocably, wonderfully, hers.